Hey everybody, it's Jim from Cigars. I'm here on a rather brisk and windy spring day to talk about dry boxing. So what we're going to do in this video is we're going to cover what is dry boxing, kind of define it, why you'd want to do it, and if you should do it. And lastly, if you do it, how do you do it? That's what we're going to talk about. So why don't we start out with a definition here. The basic concept of dry boxing is removing cigars from a humidor environment for a period of time before we smoke them. And the term comes from actually using an empty wooden box in what's dry and not humidified, in other words, environment, and basically keeping your cigars in there for a period of time from the humidor to when you smoke them. Next question is, why do people dry box? What is the motivation to do that? What are the benefits of it? And one thing about dry boxing I think we have to accept is it is not a objective scientific process. It is very much, one person may think it's a great idea to dry box. They may do it for a short time. Another person may think it's a terrible idea. Another person likes to do it for a long time. And as we look at the whys of the benefits of dry boxing, a lot of these are pretty subjective and subject to opinion. One school of thought is we use dry boxing to kind of dry out the more humid spots in a cigar. We may not realize it, but within the humidor, your cigars don't have equal balanced humidity throughout. Maybe you've experienced this, I certainly have, but you take your cigar right out of the humidor and you light it up, and about a third of the way down, all of a sudden you get this bulge in your wrapper and you say, what is this? And the bulge turns into a big crack as the wrapper kind of explodes. That's excess humidity that's built up either in the binder perhaps, or right under the binder in the filler, but pretty much toward the outside of the cigar. And as the cigar warms up and the hot air passes through it, it almost creates steam that expands then and explodes the side of the cigar out a little bit. There is a belief that dry boxing does resolve that issue, and I found that in my own personal experience that does work. Another factor is just plain wrapper and binder combustibility. Again, those are on the outside of the cigar, and when we dry box the cigar, those are going to be the first components affected by the lower humidity. So if we dry box for a day or two, those may be a little bit drier, which makes them more combustible. And the wrapper and the binder are actually very important in the burn of a cigar. So having those at the right level of combustibility really helps a lot. The last thing I'm going to talk about is something I've experienced, and I'm curious if you have too. But when you're smoking a cigar, you get this impression that the cigar is sluggish and kind of too moist. I found my experience to be when I take cigars out of a fresh pack, those pre-humidified bags that seal up. When you take them out of there, I think the humidity tends to be pretty high in those things. And I always have an issue with those cigars being a little bit what I would refer to as sluggish, burning not really good on the outside, a little canoeing, needing relights, and all that kind of stuff. Now that we've talked about the benefits of dry boxing, maybe you're considering doing it. So if you do, here's a few tips that may help you along the way. We're going to talk about it in 4 areas: the vessel or container that we dry box in, how long we dry box for, and then the humidity and the temperature. So let's start by talking about the container. This is what I use. This is an old wooden cigar box. And if you want to use one of these and you don't have any laying around, you can go to your cigar shop and maybe they'll give you one or charge you $1 or something to have one. But make sure it's got a pretty tight seal on it, Spanish cedar wood. There are other ways you can do that, though. You can do a Tupper door, which is a great way to do it. If you do that, though, I would try to put a little Spanish cedar in there, either cedar spills or cedar shavings. The reason why they say that the traditional method of using a wooden box is really good is because it sort of moderates the transfer of humidity, transfers out of the cigar back into the wood, and kind of keeps it from getting too dry. Another one would be a Herfador, your travel humidor, if you have one. As long as you're not humidifying inside of it at the moment, it's a good place to dry box. Another idea would be if you have a small humidor, wood humidor that's not being used for anything at the moment, it's dormant and not being humidified, you can use that as your dry box as well. So that's a good idea. When I first started experimenting with dry boxing, though, I just put them out on my desk in a spot I knew where nobody would bother them. The reason I did it that way, and this is an important point because we're going to kind of shift into talking about humidity now, is you have to have the humidity be certainly lower than your humidor humidity. So if you live in a real tropical, humid climate with 80% humidity, you don't want to take your cigars out of the humidor and dry box them in higher humidity. So pretty much if you live in a climate like that, dry boxing probably isn't something that you could do unless you can find a spot with lower humidity. In my particular case, during the winter, I humidify the whole house up to about 35 or 40%. And you want to be between about 35 and 65% for dry boxing. If you're over 65%, you may as well leave them in your humidor. And if you're under 35%, the air is going to be a little bit too dry and probably dry them out faster than you would want to. Before we move on to talking about temperature, probably the most contentious part of dry boxing is differences of opinion on how long to do it. A lot of people go with 1 day, and that's very, very common. A lot of people say 2 or 3 days. There are people who say 7 days. And where I fall in this is I think about 1 to 3 days is optimal. And there are a lot of expert opinions that I researched that seem to fall into that range. But it really is up to you, because one of the things that I've learned in doing this research about dry boxing is that you really have to do it based on your own preferences and how your cigars are in your humidor and all your personal situations. Take all those into account and experiment. I think that's the best advice in terms of fooling around with dry boxing. There's a lot of ways that you could do it. So try it for yourself if you think it's something you want to do, and figure out what's best for your situation. Final consideration is temperature. Just like humidity, you want it within a reasonable range. What I like to do is dry box my cigars at the temperature I think I'm going to be smoking it at. So if it's going to be a 55 or 60 degree day, I'll try to dry box it in a relatively cool place. Again, I would recommend, in terms of a range, anywhere from about 60 to 75 in terms of dry boxing with controlled humidity. Okay, that's all I got for today. Hope you got something out of this. I'll see you next time from Cigars, Cigars, Cigars.